Board. Um, can somebody just confirm they can see the slides, all right? Yeah, perfect. All right. This is a repeat of a presentation I did last autumn, and I put it back on again because I had several people come to me and say, would I do so? So this is it's a repeat of last year's. Please, as you go through, if you've got a question you want to ask, you just chip in and or put it in the chat, and we can come back to it at the end. So we'll crack on. A bit of a standard disclaimer. So what I'm trying to give you at least an overview of what to do around volunteering. What I don't know is your own business structure and how you use volunteers within your own businesses. So I can't really offer direct advice as to how you should best do it. I'm happy to do that on the phone and off the webinar. But what I will do is go through the law, processes and procedures that you might then want to sort out for your own business. Let me just start off with being clear about what volunteering is and what volunteering is not. So volunteering is an individual who's spending unpaid, and I'll come back to that unpaid bit a little bit later, doing something to help somebody else. And it's a free choice. There's no compunction. The person's giving freely of their time to help whatever organization that they're trying to do. So they're not an employee by definition, and therefore, as we'll come to talk about later, they're not covered by employment law. So there is a difference between paid staff and volunteers, and it should always be clear. That distinction should always be clear in the way that you use them, describe them, and recruit them. So volunteering is the volunteer's choice. They're not the same as employee roles, and ideally, volunteers are not seen to be a replacement for paid staff. And now, volunteers are extensively used. This is from the British Equestrian Health of Riding Establishment Survey from last year. And manpower, workforce is a big issue for most riding schools. Just under half said that they didn't have sufficient paid workforce. About half were saying that they could do more lessons and do more if they actually had sufficient staff. And 65% of the total workforce for a lot of schools were volunteers. And overall, there's an estimate there's a need for something between 3,500 and 5,000 volunteers across the 1,500 or so riding schools that we've got in the UK. So volunteers are an important constituent of many riding schools, but not all. There's also a study done by the BF on urban equestrian centres. Because they're urban, they have a slightly different characteristics to some other riding schools, but they do give you some interesting statistics from it. And particularly in the urban areas, there was high reliance on volunteer support as part of a blended workforce, so both paid and volunteers working together. They had a whole range of roles, from reporting the care of the horse to running day-to-day activities. And the privately run urban equestrian centres were slightly less reliant on the volunteers than the not-for-profit charitable centres. And I guess that's probably not surprising. Now, what's the law? And this is probably quite important. First thing, there is no legal definition of a volunteer, surprisingly. But what is important is that legally, there's not inadvertently an employment contract between you and the individual that's volunteering. And I'll explain a bit more about that. So an employee is created if there are three things that happen. And by the way, this doesn't need to be in writing. So firstly, that you give them a consideration. That is effectively exchanging something of value for their time. And that doesn't necessarily need to be money. It can be something else like a riding lesson. And this can be minimal. It doesn't have to be a large sum of money. So what you mustn't do is create a consideration. The second thing that creates a contract is if there's an obligation. So that you, as an employer, as an employee, have an obligation to provide work, and they, the employee, have an obligation to do that work. So you're setting out both sides of the equation. And then lastly, there's an intention, so that there's an intention to enter into a legally binding contract. So those are the three things that make an employment contract. They don't have to be written, and actually they don't even have to be verbally agreed. It can be implied by the circumstance and the relationship. And that's really important. You need to make sure you don't inadvertently fall into creating a contract by the behaviors that you exhibit with your volunteers. So the bottom line is your work with volunteers must be seen as a genuine volunteering relationship and not some sort of pseudo-employment contract. Now, there are a few other bits and pieces. Firstly, in getting a council license, you need to be able to demonstrate that you have sufficient number of people who are competent for the purpose and must be available to provide a level of care that ensures welfare of horses. Now, that doesn't mean to say everybody's going to be paid, but when you do your council license, you have to be able to convince the council licensing officer that you have sufficient people, paid and volunteer, with the right qualifications to meet the council licensing obligations. And you also need to try and avoid the appearance that paid roles are being purposefully displaced so volunteers can do the work in exchange. There's nothing wholly illegal about it, but it may get you into trouble with the HMRC. So you need to avoid the implication that the only difference between paid staff and volunteers is a salary or financial reimbursement. There needs to be you need to create a clear differentiation between your staff and your volunteers, so that volunteers are really seen as complementary and supplementary to your work, to your paid workforce staff. Now, what happens if you do inadvertently create an employment contract? Well, if you do, your volunteer will then suddenly be entitled to workforce rights. So that's things like the minimum wage, Quality Act, whistleblowing, hours they're allowed to work, paid holiday, and they get employee rights, such as belonging to trade unions, not really an issue, but statutory sick pay is really an issue. So if you do create inadvertently employment right, you can suddenly find yourself in a position where you have to pay the minimum wage and you have to give them statutory sick pay and holiday pay. So there are some actions you need to take to minimize the risk. The first thing is you mustn't give your volunteers an income or a consideration. And that doesn't need to be necessarily a monetary payment or something of financial high value. It can be including perks and benefits that have a value. So, for example, you should not be giving volunteers free riding lessons, or you mustn't be giving them training that is not necessary by their role. And you should have a role description for your volunteers that describes the necessary training that's required. So you must be careful not to unnecessary training and give them free riding lessons. And you can't give them fixed sums like stipends or awards. You can't pseudo pay them. What you can do is provide training that's necessary for the volunteer's role. And so creating a role description for the volunteer is quite important, because then within that volunteer role, you can set out what training is reasonable for that volunteer to be given. And you can reimburse reasonable out-of-pocket expenses. So things like travel or food, clothing, care for dependents, including children. And I have created a fact sheet, which is on the website, that sets out what is considered to be reasonable reimbursement. And you need to be able to demonstrate with a written that these expenses are reasonable, with some form of written expenses policy, and to have some form of expenses form, so you can demonstrate that the expenses you're paying the individual are related to expenses that they've incurred in accordance with your policy. Otherwise, it could be interpreted that you're giving them some form of stipend, reward, or consideration. That's the first thing. The second thing is you need to reduce perks that could be seen as a consideration. That doesn't include the things that are necessary for a volunteer role. So you might be giving them protective clothing. You know, for example, you might be giving them a polo shirt or a t-shirt that's got your logo on it. That's fine. But as I say, you shouldn't be giving them something that would be considered to be of value. So, for example, you can't say to a volunteer, "I'll only give you training if you stay with me for 6 months." If the role description says individual requires training, then you should be giving them training. You can give some minor perks, providing they are at your discretion and not interpreted to be an automatic right as part of a relationship. So let me give you an example. I said you shouldn't give free riding lessons, but that doesn't mean to say that once in a while, and it's not an automatic right, and it's at your discretion, that you don't go out for a hack, a team hack. That would be fine. But what it needs to be is seen to be at your discretion, not an automatic right, and it's a minor perk. And then you've got to be careful that those discretionary perks don't then become customary. You need to make it clear in everything that you do that you're not intending that there's a contract between you and the volunteer. So you explain in volunteer documents, such as agreements and policies, that there's no intention to create a legally binding relationship. But this isn't an easy get-out clause. If the arrangement between you and your volunteer looks like a contract, it is a contract. So just writing, "This is not a contract," doesn't get out of it, but you should still write it because it is some level of protection. And you need to create a clear distinction between your paid workers and your volunteers so that to an outside observer, the relationship between you and the volunteers and you and your paid staff is clear and distinctive. So, if you've got, for example, a yard polo shirt or a jacket, you can have the name volunteer on it and staff on it. That's an example on the name or on a name badge. Then you need to reduce a volunteer's obligations. So you can't ask a volunteer to commit to minimum hours or even to certain time periods. What you can have is reasonable expectations, but you have to acknowledge that the volunteer is not obliged and has the right to leave at any time. So what you can't do is set out, a fixed timetable for your volunteer that this is their agreement, and it's something that they're happy to do with. And if for some reason they can't do it, you have to be able to accept that. So they can't be so tied into your business that your business couldn't run if they suddenly decided they couldn't do a Monday at 9 o'clock. And then you need to be sure when you're talking about your volunteers that you don't use language that implies a contractual relationship. So you don't use words such as contract, job, or requirements. What you do is you have an agreement or role or hopes or expectations. And volunteers should have role descriptions, not job descriptions. So your staff have job descriptions and your volunteers have role descriptions. In terms of age limit, there is no upper age limit on volunteering. But do check your insurance policies because your insurance may provide restrictions within their cover, particularly for children under 16 or over a certain age. So do check your insurance policy, but there's no legal age limit on the upper side. A child under the age of 14, so 13 and under, cannot work for a profit-making organization, even if it's not paid. So you should have nobody volunteering for you who's under the age of 14. And if you're employing them 14 to 16, you do need to get a local authority approval as well. So most councils do require you to have a work permit for each child that's of school age. It does vary from council to council. It's only a legal requirement for paid work, but some councils do ask for it for voluntary roles as well. You just need to check with your local council what their rules are. And a lack of a child employment permit may end up invalidating your insurance. So it's worth checking. But do be careful with school-age children about how you use them. So my top tip really is for children under the age of 14 or really under the age of 16, you're better off to some degree running a riding club that includes a subscription or paid for stable management training or something, because as soon as it becomes a club for which they have given you money, it then becomes a service that you're providing. It's no longer volunteering. It then becomes a paid service as part of the services that you offer from your riding school. In terms of legal rights, volunteers don't have much in the way of legal rights, and they have less legal protection than paid staff. The Equalities Act and Employment Rights Act don't apply, but you just need to be careful because you may be responsible for a volunteer's discriminatory actions because you ask them to do something on your behalf. So if, for example, you've got somebody who's running your reception, and they're a volunteer, and they discriminate with somebody because of disability, sex, sexual preference, or any of those sorts of things, then you could still be liable for the volunteer's behaviour. They do have rights, so under Health and Safety at Work Act, as all people do, and they do have certain rights under the Harassment Act. If they can demonstrate that they've been emotionally harmed or threatened while volunteering with you. So let me now just talk about recruiting. Before I do so, does anybody have any questions on that? Because I've gone through that in quite a pace, and there are some quite important bits in there. So any questions, please pipe up. Let's see if there's anything in the chat. No, so no questions? Okay. If you do, then chip in and unmute. Okay, let me just talk a little bit about recruiting. Many volunteers just end up in a riding school by happen chance because you know them, or they were riding with you, or whatever. So a lot of volunteers don't end up because there was ever an original intention to have volunteers as part of the staff. And what I would strongly recommend is that volunteers shouldn't be an accident. They should be part of a planned workforce. So what I really recommend people do is, and it needs a bit of thinking about, but it's about looking at your workforce and deciding how you would have a blended workforce, what roles or jobs your paid or unpaid staff would do, and actually, yes, that's about assessing needs. It's about defining roles and jobs, because only when you do that can you then start to recruit effectively. So it will always happen that you'll get some volunteers by accident. They'll just end up as part of your team. But I do strongly recommend that you look at your workforce in its totality and make conscious choices, not accidental choices on the use of volunteers. Sorry, let me go back. And then you've got to recognise that people are volunteering for a whole variety of reasons, and their motivations can be influenced by all sorts of things. So it could be that they just love horses, or they're equestrian enthusiasts, or they want to develop a new skill, or it gives them a sense of purpose, or they want to learn to look after animals, or they want to get some sort of physical outdoor activity. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why people volunteer. And it's important you understand that, because if you want to recruit and you want to retain staff, you need to understand what it was that motivated them to come and volunteer with you in the first place. And also it's important when you're starting to put your recruitment campaigns together that you understand that there are things that motivate people that aren't always obvious to you because you're running the business and you're an equestrian enthusiast. It could be it could be that they're not even that interested in horses. It could be that they just want to get involved for community involvement. So understanding what motivates people is important. Regardless of their motivation or reason for volunteering, you should be volunteering through a safer recruitment process. So what I would recommend you do is you think about your workforce, both your paid and unpaid. You work out what jobs you think are important and how many people you should have doing, the paid work, and what you think what roles you think your volunteers would do. And then you then go through an active process of recruitment, not just have people drop in on you and take them from accidental recruitment. I'm not saying it's not wrong, because often a person you know is better than a person you don't. But you should still be doing some definable recruitment process which will protect you legally. So safe recruitment ensures that staff and volunteers are suitable for working with children, young people, and adults with risks. So that's all about ensuring that they've got the necessary DDS spec and that sort of stuff. But it's also about making sure that people who aren't suitable for all sorts of reasons are rejected before they become a member of your staff. And then it's about retaining the records so you can demonstrate due diligence if something goes wrong and you need to either demonstrate something to a local authority or you need to demonstrate it to the local council. For volunteers, procedures can be tailored whether the proprietor knows the applicant personally. So I'm definitely not saying don't have a volunteer because you know them. I mean, it's often a very good way of doing it. But as a minimum, just make sure you've got the necessary documentation in place. For example, vetting and disclosure and barring checks are done to protect yourself. Now, the process I'm going to talk about is as applicable to paid staff as it is to volunteers. So this is what I call a safer recruitment process, where it says role for a paid staff, it would be job. But in principle, the steps I'm going to take you through are as applicable to somebody applying for a job as it is as applying for a role, a volunteer role. So the first thing is you do need to define the role, and I've described that as part of a broader activity to understand what your workforce is going to look like. And in your role description, you're going to cover things like the duties, the extent of any responsibilities they might have for young people and adults at risk, essential and desirable qualifications, experience, competence, and qualities. All of those will be in a role description. And ensure when you're defining the role and the things you're going to do that they will tap into the motivators that I discussed previously. Then you need to consider about how you might advertise and be clear on the mix of qualities, qualifications, experience that you would expect a successful candidate to be able to demonstrate. Because if you don't do that, you'll get unwanted applications. And include a statement that confirms your commitment to safeguarding. You should create some sort of applicant pack, which would be an application form, some notes about how to complete the form. You would ask them about referees. You would have the role description and personal specification there. You might have something that says how you're going to select volunteers, and then anything you want to tell about your riding school. Then you move on to interviewing, and you'll get a set of applications in. You advise those you want to interview and you thank those you don't. And then you've got to say the when and where. And I would strongly recommend that you have more than just you in an interview panel so you can demonstrate that the behaviours you're doing an interview are fair and unbiased. If you're going to have a trial session, which is perfectly reasonable to do for a volunteer, you need to make sure that it's less than 3 hours. There is some case law where people were asked to stay a whole day volunteering, and it then went to tribunal, and there were they were forced to be paid a full day's pay. So generally, I would say if you're going to have a trial session, make it a morning or an afternoon, but not a whole day, and then be clear about what it'll involve and what they need to bring with them. There is a thing on the Equestrian Employers Association website, which, if you're an ABRS member, you get automatic access to, which will help you create interview evaluation forms with questions. And that's a very good way of doing it, because what it'll do is it helps you create some impartial questions, but it also allows you to have a form that you can demonstrate that you've done due diligence and you've not been discriminatory. Then you need to go into checks. And there are a number of things you need to do. You need to check any references they give you, and particularly about their suitability to work with children, young people, and adults. You need to do identity checks, and that's about making sure that the identity they've given is genuine, has existed over time, that it's not part of fraud, and it is the person who they say there is. And you'll see there's a couple of links, and this again is on the website, which takes you to how to do an identity check and what documents you should expect to ask for in an identity check. And there's normally you normally ask for a couple of documents. One might be a driving license or a passport, and it might be evidence of an address. But in both of those forms, it does explain how to do it in both those links. And then you need to do the DBS check. Only you can do the DBS check. People like the ABRS can't do it because you're the employer. But no, if you're doing a DBS check for a volunteer, it's normally quite cheap. It isn't expensive. So there is on the website, on the government website, a DBS check tool, and if you go into that, it'll help you work out what sort of check that individual needs. Not everybody needs an enhanced DBS check with barring. It may be just a criminal record check, but that tool will help you do that. And there's a similar online guide in Scotland that you can use for that. And then remember, the minimum age for DBS is 16, and that means nobody under the age of 16 should have any supervision responsibilities. Right? And then finally, right to work. If people are volunteering, there isn't a need to check on the right to work. But if you do have employees, of course, you do need to check on their right to work in the UK. Overseas people, though, do need to have a visa that allows them to volunteer, or they need to have settled or pre-settled status. Finding volunteers is not easy. You do need to go to people you know. You can use social media. You can do open events. They're often very successful. You can participate in community events, clubs and groups. There are job boards. So the NCVO, for example, National, I'm not sure what that stands for, but the NCVO is the volunteer organisation, National Charity for Volunteer Organisations, I think it is. They've got a job board, and you can go into things like schools and colleges and see if there are people who wish to volunteer. That's the DV volunteering, because the DV teams are often a good source of volunteers, particularly for kids who are doing gold, because they're more in the right age group. So do go and look at DVs at schools, for example. Okay. Any questions on that before I move on? Okay. All right. Managing volunteers. You need to, if you want to retain volunteers, you need to support them. But there are things that you need to do. Every volunteer should know who's responsible for them, so who's their manager, and who they should talk to if they've got a problem. Just as you would with a paid employee, you do need to do an induction to ensure the volunteer is properly equipped for the role. And that's no different to any paid employee. What we do offer inside the ABRS, for ABRS members, we do have what's called the Equestrian Care Awards. They're quite good if you're putting volunteers into horse management or horse care roles. you can go through the 3 levels of the ECAs, and that will evidence to the council that you're providing your volunteers with recognised training. So, and it's pretty good. It's all the training ABRS provides is very practically based, and this is very practically based training. You may, if they've got anything where they're going to have unsupervised access to children or adults with risk, you'll need to put them on a safeguarding course. Again, go on our website, and we do safeguarding courses every month, online safeguarding courses, which they can attend. I would always recommend that you have regular meetings with your volunteers. You want to know, are they enjoying the role? And if they are enjoying the role, what is it about? What is it that they're enjoying? What successes have they got? What difficulties are they facing? And then you can work out if they need support or training as you go forward. And just don't assume or presume. Encourage feedback from them. Otherwise, you'll never know if they're happy or not happy. And lastly, don't forget to say thanks. There are often key anniversaries where it's good to say thanks. So the anniversary when the volunteer first started, or during the National Volunteers Week, which we've just had. And be careful in the way you do it. What you don't want to do is create winners and losers if you start to single out individuals within your team. Unfortunately, there are times when you might need to dismiss a volunteer. It should always be I'll come back in a moment on that. You can ask a volunteer to leave, but it should normally be the last resort. And that's really normally when you've not found a way forward. But it might be necessary. It could be because they've made a serious breach of conduct or whatever. They're not entitled to employment rights, but you should still treat them fairly and should not discriminate. And therefore, you should go through a proper dismissal process of scheduling a time to meet, offering somebody to be with them when they come to meet you, explaining to them why they're being asked to leave and why, thanking them for what they've done, and then making sure that you followed up in writing. And that will protect you downstream, particularly if they want to start to claim that they were, for example, actually really an employee, not a volunteer. Insurance contracts require what's called the utmost good faith from the purchaser of the insurance, which means that you always have it's your obligation to tell your insurance all relevant information that might affect the insurance. So if you're going to take on volunteers, make sure that you tell your insurer, and it's ideal that you have employer's liability and public liability insurance along with that. You should have certainly public liability anyway, but I do recommend employer's liability as well. Now, on the website, I've put a ton of resources. There's a link to the NCVO. I've put this, you'll find this presentations on there. I then put a whole bunch of things like volunteer opportunities, rights, expenses, safe recruitment, a handbook that you can tailor for your own establishment, a disciplinary procedure, performance management, grievance, social media, IT, an application form, an expenses form, an expenses policy, the fact sheet, a template for a role description, and an example of one, an agreement template where the volunteer writes back accepting accepting the role, a training policy, and an induction template plans. All those are on the ABRS website in the members area, and you can just download them if you want to. So, in the long and short, what's the difference? So, workers and employees, they have the worker has a contract, must turn up for work. You have responsibilities under the contract, and they are protected by employment law. An employee must also, on top of that, work regular hours, be expected to be paid, have tax and national insurance, can't send somebody to you to do the job on their behalf, and they are protected by employment law. And the volunteer is unpaid, is there of free will, has no contract, has no commitment, can expect to have reasonable expenses reimbursed, The role is for the benefit of others, you and others, and is not protected by employment law. That's really the key differences. So the DBS checks for volunteers, Liz. No, it depends. So it depends if you're going for enhanced. If you go in for a basic DBS check, I don't think it's you pay. But if you go into enhanced, so for example, you go to say CIC, which is the one we recommend, I think it's £17 for a volunteer for an enhanced DBS. I think you might be right for basic DBS, but I think enhanced and where they're doing the checking list, I think you do have to still pay, but it's substantially less than for a worker.
The one that I use is normally £47 per person, and if you tick that they're a volunteer, they do it for free, and I have done enhanced ones.
Good. Well, so that's useful because so who are you using? Because
so that's active background checks.
Okay, let me write that down because
I'm sure they were, unless they've changed it.
I'll have a look.
But I've definitely done them, and they were definitely enhanced.
Okay. It could well be. They may be doing other. They might be swallowing the choosing to swallow the.
Yeah, like it was about at least a year ago I did one, but so they might have changed it. But yeah.
Yeah. I'll have a look and see. So is anyone got any questions on that? Feel free to unmute if you want to ask any questions. Let me just stop sharing for a second, and let me just stop the recording.